Good afternoon. On behalf of the director of the Ramón Areces Foundation, Mr. Raimundo Pérez Hernández, let me give you a warm welcome to this foundation and to this conference. Let me introduce myself. My name is Daniel Santín. I'm professor of economics at the Complutense University of Madrid, and I'm also in charge of coordinating some of the activities that are organized or sponsored by the foundation. This event will be in English. However, since one of the priorities of this foundation is to foster the use of the Spanish language in science, let me do part of this introduction in Spanish. Bien, en primer lugar, quiero agradecerle.
First of all, I would like to thank you all very much for having come to the foundation to listen to this lecture titled Family, Culture and Gender, delivered by Professor Fernández from the University of New York. Thank you very much, Raquel, for joining us today, for having come all the way to the foundation in Madrid. It is a privilege to have you with us to be able to listen to your talk. I'm speaking in Spanish because although Professor Fernández is going to give her presentation in English, for technical reasons and because of the vocabulary she's going to use, she understands Spanish very well. So you will be able to ask your questions in Spanish. Secondly, I would like to thank the Carlos III University in Madrid, represented by Professor Matilde Machado, who is going to be chairing this session. She's really participated very actively in the organization of this lecture. She is a tenured professor of the Carlos III University, and amongst many other merits, I would like to mention that she's been president of the Committee on the Situation of Women in Economics, and that is precisely when I was lucky enough to meet her. And thirdly, for those of you who are not familiar with the goals or with the activities of the foundation, because perhaps it is the first time that you have come to our venue, let me tell you that the foundation is aimed at disseminating the performance of excellent science in Spain. And for that, it has three axes: social sciences, humanities, and basic science. And it organizes a multiplicity of activities. In social sciences, for example, I would just like to mention our postgraduate programs abroad for the most outstanding students. When they finish their graduate studies, they can travel to the best universities in the world to do a postgraduate degree. We also have doctoral studies. We also have the research projects for scholars under the age of 40. The foundation also has several partnerships with some of the most important research centers in the world, such as the London School of Economics or MIT. And last but not least, I would just like to mention that one of the most important activities of the foundation is precisely organizing lectures open to the general public to connect excellent science with civil society, so that knowledge doesn't just stay in academic papers, and to make sure that science can reach society at large. So, without further ado, let me give the floor to Professor Fernández.
Buenas tardes a todos.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Matilde Machado. As Daniel mentioned, I'm a tenured professor of the Department of Economics of the Carlos III University of Madrid, and I would just like to start by thanking the foundation and Daniel Santín for making this event possible. In collaboration with my university, we managed to bring Raquel Fernández, a very distinguished economist. It is an honor for me to introduce Raquel Fernández, who's a Silver Professor at the Department of Economics of the University of New York. Professor Fernández is a fellow of the Econometric Society and has been vice president of the American Economic Association. She's a member of the MBR, BRED, which is an organization devoted to promoting development economics. She's also a member of CPR, where she has also presided over the public policy program. She's also co-director of an economic group of EDR, and she's also a member of the scientific committee of the Scientific and Economic Association, the Barcelona School of Economics, the wider UBS Europe, and RICH. Previously to joining New York University, she taught at other universities of renown, such as Costume University and the Oslo University. I have known Professor Fernández for quite a long time, since she was at Boston University, so that's, quite a few years ago. But this profession, relationships tend to last quite a long time. And then, a couple of years ago, I did a stint at the University of New York, and then a mild New York winter allowed us to share a lot of cups of coffee together during the pandemic. Raquel belongs to that class of scientists who do not only open up new lines of research, but who also create new areas within their own field of inquiry. Her work is pioneering in terms of the interaction between culture and society, and she's also studied topics such as sovereign debt, development economy, inequality, gender economics, and aspects of macroeconomy and political economy. The results of her work have been published in the best journals, and she has received funding from highly prestigious universities such as the National Science Foundation. Yesterday, when I was preparing my talk, until yesterday, she had over 15,000 academic citations in Google, and I'm sure that most of you know what that means. She was born in Argentina, so she has a very close relationship with Latin America, and she's also done a lot of research. In 2024, for example, she received the Carlos Diaz Alejandro Award for those who have contributed to the analysis of topics relevant to the Latin American region. She's also played a very important role in making women economists more visible in Latin America. She's created an institution called WALA for women economists. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. I'll just leave the floor to Raquel, who will be talking about family, culture, and gender today. And I'm sure you are going to learn many very interesting things from Raquel. Thank you.
Hola, muy buenos días.
Hello, good morning. Thank you very much, Matilde, for this wonderful and generous introduction. It is a pleasure for me to be with all of you today. And it is also an honor to be here at the foundation, at the Ramón Areces Foundation. And I'm going to be speaking English, and I apologize for that. But I always studied economics in English, and all my slides are in English. But I'm sure that you're going to have perfect translation, so I don't think there's going to be any problems at all. I will just start by motivating why I have chosen this topic. It is difficult for me to switch to English, but anyway.
Okay. This is an economics talk. So one thing that people might ask is, why should economists care about family and culture? It's not the typical economics subject. But in the end, people are social animals. I'm certainly not the first to say that. They live embedded in social fabrics, they live embedded in social networks, and in these networks and fabrics, the family plays a central role. So the family is important to us understanding economic outcomes because it's the fundamental unit that organizes economic activities. It's also the fundamental unit in transmitting social or cultural beliefs. And these beliefs, I'm going to argue, and I'm going to give you examples of this, matter to a whole host of economic outcomes that then affect development, welfare, and inequality. The main message that I would like you to come out of this talk with is that differences in family institutions and cultural beliefs really need to be taken into account to understand how an economy works, and in particular to understand the role of policies and how policies will affect outcomes. What I'm going to be doing today is going to be giving you a series of examples. They're all summarized in my chapter, which came out last year in the Handbook of Family Economics with Natalie Bao. So some quick definitions. I'm not going to spend much time on this. I think everybody knows what or thinks they know what the family is. What I've put up here is a definition of the family that comes from anthropology. So it's the smallest group of individuals who see themselves as connected to one another. They share economic opportunities, rights, responsibilities. They fulfill basic human needs. They provide for kids. They define parental roles. They regulate sexuality. They pass property and knowledge across generations. What about culture? There's far too many definitions of culture. And for our purposes, it doesn't really matter very much which one we take. I'm just giving you one here that comes from the dictionary. So think about it as a customary beliefs, social forms and material traits of a racial, religious, or social group. And an important part of this is the intergenerational transmission of knowledge and social beliefs. Now, is family an institution or is it culture? I don't think we need to distinguish between the two, certainly not in this context. And I'm just going to use a quote here that I agree with from a recent paper by Schultz and co-authors, who say that they think of the family as a set of culturally transmitted norms that influence a broad range of social relations. Why? Precisely for the reasons that we said before, because a family is a fundamental unit in terms of transmitting social beliefs and organizing economic activity. So I'm going to be giving you a series of examples. They're all kind of a little bit all over the place on purpose, I should add. And the first one I'm going to do is to explore how kinship matters, different forms of kinship. And I'm going to start out with thinking about variations in family institutions. In particular, here it's going to be the definitions of kinship, or the form of kinship takes, and see how it matters to various, very different outcomes. The first one is going to be with respect to conflict. So these are all relatively recent papers. This is one by Moscona, Nunn, and Robinson from 2020. And what they do is that they are interested in systems of varying kinship intensity. And here they studied segmentary lineage system. What is a segmentary lineage system? Well, we're very used to thinking in Western societies of descent that comes both from the mother and from the father. That is, if I ask you who your grandparents are, you're going to talk about your mother and your father and their parents. In the unilineal descent, which is a segmentary lineage system, it's either always through the father or always through the mother, but not both. So that defines your family relationships. Those are the people you feel responsibility towards. These segments, subsets of a lineage, function as autonomous group, and these autonomous groups matter for political, judicial, administrative functions. So here I've given you an example. I think Okay, here I'm giving you an example. Let me do it this way, where you have, let's say, one father. I'm going to put a patrilineal system here. One father who has two sons, A and B, and then they go on to have two sons themselves, and those go on to have two sons themselves, and here you have the whole different lineage system. Let's think about a situation in which individual 1 over here gets into a conflict with individual 9 over here. When that happens, individual 1 can count on the support of this minimal segment here, sorry, the smaller one, and furthermore, the minor segment here, and the major segment here. Similarly, for individual 9, they can count on the support of this minor segment, the minimal segment, the minor segment here, and the major segment here. So what anthropologists hypothesized is that the fact that societies are organized this way, in which these relationships are very important, that might lead to longer and more frequent, perhaps, conflict. Precisely because it does not stay between individual 1 and 9, but rather the whole major segment A and the whole major segment B becomes involved in a conflict. So that's a hypothesis that anthropologists put forward, but that had not been studied empirically. So what I'm going to give you here is the results of the study that these authors did in the continent of Africa. So the figure on the left here is showing you for different ethnic groups, the dark ones are segmentary lineage, what we just discussed. The light gray ones are not segmentary lineage. And the white ones are ethnic groups that are outside of the sample. And then on the right-hand side, which is much more difficult to see, those little dots, so don't worry if you can't see them, those are all incidents of conflict. These are conflicts that occurred between 1997 and 2014, which is when the data is available for. And then what the authors did was to look at the relationship that exists between conflict and being of a segmentary lineage. And the way they did this was to regress the segmentary lineage, that's 0, 1, and purge it of other things that might matter. For example, country, the geographic controls, a series of historical controls that include pre-industrial levels of political centralization, pre-industrial levels of economic developments, and an indicator for being a patrilineal versus a matrilineal system. They also did the same sort of residualization for how many conflicts there were. And when they did that, you have on the x-axis you have on the x-axis this residualized level of segmentary lineage, and on the y-axis you have different measures of conflict. A over there is showing you all conflicts, B is showing you civil conflicts, C is showing you non-civil conflicts, and D is showing you intragroup conflicts. What you can see throughout them is that there exists a relatively strong positive relationship between these two measures. In other words, societies that come from segmentary lineage appear to have more conflicts, no matter how we measure those conflicts. Now, this is a partial correlation, so in order to study more precisely causality, what the authors do is that they do a boundary discontinuity. So what does that mean? Well, let's look at these two ethnic groups. I'm going to say that the segmentary lineage one is this dark one here, and the non-segmentary lineage is this lighter one here. They share a common boundary. The question is, what happens to the number of conflicts that we have as we move from the right towards the left? The idea is that as you move towards a boundary, everything else, geography, history, is hopefully moving continuously. It need not be the same, but it's changing continuously. And the question is, do we see a discontinuous change in the number of conflicts? That is to try to get at the idea of causality. So when the authors do this, As you get very far from the boundary, so you are a non-segmentary lineage, you see that, there isn't much conflict. Here, we're not really making an emphasis on this positive slope, but rather that the fact that when you get to the border, when the distance of the border is 0 kilometers, you see a discontinuous jump in the number of conflicts. And that discontinuity is giving you evidence that there is something that's happening as you become, as we move towards the location of an ethnic group that's segmentary. Enough on that one. I'm now going to talk about something which also has to do with kinship, which is cousin marriage. This is, again, a measure of intensity of kinship, okay? These are relationships in which kin is very important. And this slide over here is not meant to do more than anything than give you some motivation. So what you see on this slide is on the x-axis, the percentage of marriages that are between first or second cousins. They're measured in a log scale. On the y-axis, also measured in a log scale, you see GDP per capita. And all you really want to get out of this picture is that there appears to be a negative relationship between the percentages of marriages that occur between first and second cousins and GDP per capita. So if we were going to ask why this relationship might exist, there's lots of great things about marrying your cousins. I mean, one of the great things about marrying your cousins or having a strong kinship relationship means that, in an agricultural world, when you have a lot of weather shocks or other type of shocks, you can insure each other. But in a world in which you're industrializing, it might mean that there's not that much movement, okay? And that might not be so good for development. So that's kind of the story that the authors wish to explore empirically and rigorously. And the way that they do that, and this is a paper that just came out in November of 2023, is that they looked at cousin marriage bans in the United States. And what they did was to exploit the fact that there is a large variation in timing across the US about when states banned the marriages of cousins. It started with Kansas in 1858, then 8 states in the 1860s, 2 in the 1870s, etc. What the authors argue is, and try to show a bit, is that the variation in timing is due to idiosyncratic factors, like one particular senator might get it into their heads that this is something that's important, and also to the states entering the union and then deciding not to keep old marriage laws, but to have new marriage laws, which then banned cousin marriage. Now, interestingly, there's no direct measure of the number of cousin marriages. So what the authors do is they construct one using US marriage records from 1750 to 1940 to calculate the excess frequency of marriages that occurs between individuals with the same surname. So if you think about a Fernandez marrying a Fernandez, that happens very easily because there's a lot of us, okay? And if you think about, I can't think of a single apellido, last name that is infrequent, Machado. I would have thought Machado is pretty frequent, but okay, let's say Machado is pretty infrequent, then that's going to happen less frequently. What we're interested in is what part is beyond random, beyond the fact that there's many Fernandezes and many Machados, because otherwise it's not cousins. So they look at the excess number of cousin marriages. They define a marriage pool as a state and a decade, and they classify names into a high cousin marriage category if this excess frequency, the part that is beyond chance, is above 10% prior to the first ban of 1858. And then what they do, so now we have high cousin marriage surnames and everyone else. Let's call everyone else low, okay? What they do is they do what's called in economics an event study. That is, they compare outcomes for men born in the same decade, in the same state, and they compare outcomes for these people decade by decade by decade, decade of birth by decade of birth, okay, as a function of did they have a ban or did they not have a ban, exploiting the fact that the ban came in at different times. For those of you who are more economists and used to seeing this, they control for state cross time fixed effects, state cohort of birth fixed effects, state and household, high household surnames fixed effects, census years fixed effects, and then what they're interested in is that beta. That is, how much does it matter that you come from a high cousin surname rather than a low cousin surname from that state? The first thing that they do is to show that this cousin bands had some bite. So over here, this -1, which is missing, there's no little dot there, that -1 is normalized to 0. That is, it's taking any differences in outcomes between high versus low cousin marriage and making them equal to 0. And you can see there's no particular effect in the red before. Once the band comes into play, then the cohorts who then come afterwards, they have fewer cousin marriages. So this is just telling you this reform, this law had some bite. You see a drop in the high cousin, in the frequency of cousin marriage rates in the high cousin marriage surnames. Then they look at things that we might care about, which have to do with mobility, in particular geographic mobility. They say, what happens to the population? Where are you living? And they show what that blue over here is showing. Oops, I would get this wrong. What the blue over here is showing is that, you know, those cohorts that were born 10 years later, 20 years later, 30 years later, 40 years later, they live in places with a greater population. Relative to whom? Relative to the low cousin surnames. So just to be 100% clear here, the United States is becoming more urban. The United States is becoming more populated. So that's not what this is capturing. What this is capturing is what is happening to people who are called Fernández relative to people who are called Machado, given that we both live in the same state, we were born in the same decade, and the question is, what happens to these Fernándezes and Machado decade after decade of birth? What happens to the type of place that we live in? And the Fernándezes go and start living in more populated places. They also are less likely to live in farms. That's the one over here. You see the drop in that probability. They live in more urban places, and they're much more likely than before to have migrated. That is, to now reside in a state other than their state of birth. So the first thing that you know is, and that's a major finding, is these cousin bands increased mobility, increased urbanization of these Fernándezes relative to the Machados. Why might this matter? This matters because if you want to take advantage of opportunities that arise, new opportunities that arise in the world, you need to be able to move to take advantage of them. If you're stuck living in the farm, which then belonged to, you know, your wife's parents, you may not take so much advantage because you have this big social network that was extremely useful many years ago, but now is stopping you from increasing social mobility. And that's what this graph here shows you. What it shows you is, as you can see in the blue, is that several decades after the ban takes place, we see occupational mobility. We see that these people, the Fernándezes relative to the Machados, are now becoming, are now in occupations that have a higher rank in terms of the income that they give. Okay. So that's in terms of thinking, two examples of terms of how kinship, how an organization of a family might matter. What I want to do next is to talk about how a family's cultural beliefs and practices might matter to outcomes. So the first thing I'm going to do is to talk to you about work of my own, which is relatively old. We started this in 2008, which tries to solve the problem of how does one measure culture. One way is taking advantage, as you saw, of the fact that families are organized differently because they come from different histories. Another way that you can do this is to use what I've called an epidemiological approach. And what the epidemiological approach does is to say, let's take advantage of the fact that culture is something that people take with them when they move, whereas economic variables and institutions are much harder to move. So let me just give you the fundamental challenge. Suppose we want to think about culture, what's the effect of culture in Spain on female labor force participation? Well, how can we study that? We can look at people's beliefs, but there's also transportation, there's also childcare facilities, there's also the type of sectors and industries that exist in the Spanish economy. How do we disentangle beliefs from economics or from institutions? We can't. That's the issue. And so the way that we do it is that we look at people who move. And we don't look at them because there's a lot of shocks that happen when people move, but we look at their descendants. And in particular, that is what we chose to do when we were interested in looking at female labor force participation and also fertility. Okay, so let me explain exactly what we did. We did this for the United States. We looked at what's called second-generation American women. That is, people like me, who was born in the United States, but their parents were born elsewhere. Both my parents were born in Argentina, okay? We do this in the 1970 US Census because that's the last census to ask individuals where their parents were born. We use the father's birthplace as ancestry, and we looked at a very narrow cohort, married women between the ages of 30 to 40, born in the US, whose parents were born elsewhere. They're not working in farms, they're not working in agriculture. We compare the outcomes for women who live in the same city and town. Why this restriction? Because we want to separate beliefs from differences across different towns, across different cities in the United States, and institutions, in transportation networks, in the ability to find someone to take care of your kids. Okay. Now, how do we measure culture? Well, there's no easy way to measure culture in the 1970s. What we do is we use, for work, female labor force participation in the country of ancestry and the total fertility rate for children in the country of ancestry. Now, these are women who are 30 to 40 years old. They're living in the United States. They're born in the United States. That must mean, simple math, that their parents came 30 to 40 years before. Well, if they came 30 to 40 years before, they must have been here in the United States sometime between 1930 and 1940. So what's the right way to measure culture? Well, you could think of many reasons that you might want to look at 1930s, et cetera. Because of data limitations, we're going to be looking at 1950. You might also argue, no, you should look for 1970, because that's how these women would have turned out had they stayed had the parents not moved. It doesn't really matter in the end. We show that these are very correlated over time. And so it's not something that we particularly need to think about. We do exclude the USSR and 10 European countries that became centrally planned around World War II, because if we're sure of anything, it's the fact that the parents were not there. So any cultural change that occurred, these parents could not have lived through it. Otherwise, their daughters would not have been born in the US and would not be 30 to 40 years old in 1970. Just one thing of interest, you might think female labor force participation and total fertility rate in countries of ancestry are very correlated. That's not true. They're actually zero correlation. It's basically pretty well estimated that it's zero. Now, I want to point out that even if culture matters tremendously in Spain in determining female labor force participation, we may fail to find it with this test. Why? Many reasons. First of all, there's assimilation. These women are born in the United States, so even if their parents are Spanish, they've been watching American television, going to American schools, have American friends, maybe have an American husband. So, number one, assimilation. Two, selection. The person who immigrates, the parents of these women, they're not ordinary people necessarily. They don't represent the mean culture. There's some selection that goes on into who becomes an immigrant. And last but not least, culture is a social phenomena. Yes, there are individual beliefs, but these individual beliefs, they're heterogeneous, and people may follow culture more or less depending on the social punishments and rewards that others, your peers, your neighbors, give you. And so even though in Spain, you might be very influenced by your culture, once you're living outside of Spain, your daughter may not be very influenced by it. So this is all just to tell you that if the cultural proxy doesn't possess explanatory value, it doesn't mean that culture is irrelevant. This is a very one-sided test. This can only show you that culture is relevant. It's not really capable of showing you that culture is irrelevant. Whoa. Okay, this is just me showing you that female labor force participation over the decades. These are the countries that are going to end up being in our sample in the US in 1970. They're very highly correlated over time. Okay, this is just the raw data. This is me showing you on the x-axis how much women used to work in 1950 in the country of ancestry. On the y-axis, we have how many hours per week, on average, second-generation American women whose parents came, say, from whichever is your favorite country, from Spain, how much they were working, how many hours they were working a week. As you can see, the numbers are quite low. And the reason that the numbers are quite low is because there's a lot of zeros there also that are bringing these numbers down. So a lot of women are not working in 1970 if they're married and between the ages of 30 and 40. But as you can see in the raw data, there's a positive relationship between how much people worked in country of ancestry and how much women work in 1970. I'm not going to bore you with too much regressions. This is the same thing. This is now controlling for a lot of other factors. One of the things, let me just explain this conceptually. One of the things you might worry about is that it's true that when you cross the ocean or you migrate, you bring your beliefs with you. It's not completely true that you don't bring any economics with you. You bring some wealth, perhaps. You bring your human capital, that is, your own education as a parent, and then those things influence your daughter. And in particular, you might worry that they influence your daughter's education. So the second column over there says, let's control for these women's education, okay? The omitted variable here is less in high school. And as you can see, there's some effective education, but it doesn't come out very strongly. Then we say, well, but also it might matter for who she ends up marrying, because more educated women tend to marry more educated men, and more educated men tend to make more money. And maybe women tend to work less when their husband makes more money. Think of 1970s if you can, okay? And that is indeed true. If you look at the third column over here, you see that when you control for the husband's characteristics, his education, and his total income, now you see strongly the effect of her own education. This over here in purple is showing you the cultural proxy, which is female labor force participation in 1950. And I'm going to concentrate on work, but very similar results are true for the cultural proxy for fertility. That is, where people had more kids, now these women also have more children. But I don't want to belabor that right now because there's not enough time. So what might you be concerned about when you look at this? Well, you're still concerned that you haven't really picked up all the ways in which human capital might be transmitted from parents to daughters. So what can we do? Well, we can use a different data set. It's smaller. It has fewer countries that controls directly for parental education. The same results go through. You can look at, say, a census, like the 1940 census, and look at people who would be the right age group to be the parents of these women. And you can control directly for how many years of education they have. You might worry it's not years of education, it's actually quality of education. So you can go and use measures that are done later on, so they don't exactly correspond, that measure how good the quality of education is in the country that these individuals came from. And perhaps most convincingly, you can do what's called a Minster regression. That is, you can regress a woman's wage on her years of potential experience or education and ask, does this cultural proxy help to explain her wage? If it does help to explain her wage, then we're missing something because it shouldn't have any explanatory value for the wage. The reason it would have explanatory value for her wage is because it's related to human capital. So we do a Minster regression, control for selection as well, and we show that this cultural proxy is not able to explain wages. We also show, to make things more convincing that this is culture, that culture matters more when people live in neighborhoods where there's more people of their ancestry. And we show, by looking at men and women who come from different countries of ancestry, that both the wife's and the husband's cultural proxies matter both for labor force participation of the women and for fertility. This approach became very popular. It's not, sometimes it's more convincing, sometimes it's less convincing. It's been used to study gender attitudes, gender gaps in math, incidence of intimate partner violence, son preference, and sex-selective abortions, a whole host of things, including corruption, trust, and violence. Okay. The next thing I want to show you, as I said, these are a series of examples, is how a practice of bride price might matter for women's education. So why would you have a bride price? So there's many hypotheses. None of them really have particular evidence going for them. That the reason that you have a particular family institution, say such as bride price, is because it helps to compensate for missing markets. What might be the missing market here? Well, parents, when they're thinking about how much to educate their children, if their children are leaving them, they're not getting the full return from their child's education. If there's a bride price, then, and if more educated women are worth more in the marriage market, this is a way to capture some of the returns to your investment in education. So the first thing that the authors want to investigate this hypothesis, and so the first thing that they do is they look at two countries, Indonesia and Zambia, in which there's a variety of ethnic groups, and the proportion of the district or province that practices or that came from a bride price ancestry, they don't necessarily practice it, they come from a bride price ancestry, is captured by the darkness of the color. So you see that there's a great deal of variation in both countries. In both countries, they show that girls get more education if they come from bride price ethnicities. So comparing those who have a bride price in Indonesia with those who do not have a bride price in Indonesia, those that come from bride price, the girls there receive more education. That's good. They attempt to rule out other explanations. Is it because they have fewer kids, and therefore they're richer? No. Is it because they're wealthier? No. And then the other part of the explanation, the girls are receiving more education. Furthermore, education is valuable. In what sense? Girls with more education receive higher bride prices. Then they go and they look at a program in Indonesia between 1973 and 1978 in which there was a large number of primary schools that were built. This had been studied previously by Esther Duflo, who recently won the Nobel Prize. And what she did was to compare treated versus, let me not speak that way. What she did was to compare cohorts who were young enough to take advantage of all these schools that were built, the primary schools, and cohorts that were too old. They were just too old to take advantage of these schools. And also looking at the intensity, schools with more school construction relative to less. She shows that there's a positive effect from these schools on boys' education. But when you look at girls' education, it doesn't make much of a difference. So girls do not take advantage, or parents of girls do not take advantage of sending them off to these primary schools that have been built. What they do is they come back to this setting, but now they say, let's not just look at girls, let's look at girls from a bride price tradition relative to girls from a non-bride price tradition. And what they show is that actually, yes, it did help to increase girls' rate of primary school completion if they came from bride price, but not otherwise. They do a similar thing for Zambia. It's a different program, and basically you get the same type of results. If you are coming from a bride price tradition, girls took advantage, but other girls did not. Okay, that was one family sort of belief. A different sort of belief, more tragic, is son preference, dowries, and how these interact with economic shocks, and in particular here, gold price shocks. So what's a dowry? Well, historically, a dowry was a bequest of parental property to the bride. Now, dowry has disappeared in most of the world, but it persists in contemporary India, despite being prohibited since 1961. It's actually becoming more common in Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. Who gets a dowry nowadays? Anderson and Bittner show that dowries are most often now appropriated by not the bride, but rather the groom and his family. Now in India, which is going to be the country of study here, dowries are very large. They're often 4 to 8 times annual household income. And gold is a very important component of them. 70 to 90% of households give dowry, 95% of them report giving gold. Given that it's so expensive, the second you have a girl that's born to your family, you have to give something between 4 and 8 times annual income, parents begin to save for the dowry. What, I guess I should, sorry, I should have said the, oops, see, I'm trying to go backwards, sorry. What Balotra, Chakravarti, and Guleshi do is to study what happens when you have gold price increases. And the idea here is pretty straightforward. When gold price increases, then if the dowry doesn't change, not in value, but in terms of pieces of gold, let's say, that's going to make a girl more expensive than before. It's also going to make a boy more attractive than before, because now the dowry is coming to the groom and to the family of the groom. Now, for this argument to be true, you need that the value of the dowry does not adjust when there's a gold price increase. So let's say the gold price goes up by 50%. If the amount of gold decreased, you would just have zero effect. What they do is they show that the dowry value increases by 80% of the percentage price increase of gold. So 80% of the price increase of gold is passed down into the dowry. Now, the price of gold, importantly, is not determined in India. It's determined on a world market. It's highly variable. As you can see in this picture, it follows a random walk. And what the authors do is to study the outcomes of second-born children. Why do they study outcomes of second-born children rather than first? Because there's a lot of evidence that families desire one girl, and so they're happy with having one girl, but they're not happy with having 2 girls. Why not study families with 3 or 4 or 5 kids? You would think there's more selection going on in the higher number of kids. Very importantly, they differentiate outcomes according to 2 periods. The first period is 1972 to 85, and then the second period is 1985 to 2005. What's the important difference between the two is that in the first period, the earlier period, there's no ultrasound. In the second period, there is ultrasound, meaning that you can have, if you want to, prenatal sex selection. Okay. Let me not take you through the regression. Let me just say they control for a very large set of variables, including the caste, the price of oil, the price of rice, how much it rained, the state in India, the year, the birth month of the child, the sex of the first child. And now they're looking at the second child. And they show that increases in the price of gold in the pre-ultrasound period, the early period, is associated with higher neonatal mortality for girls. That is, if the price of gold increases in the first month after birth of this girl, the probability that she's going to live past the first year goes down, whereas the same does not happen to boys. This doesn't mean that the parents are killing their child. What it means is, like, if your child is sick, you may not call the doctor. Or if there's little food, you may not give this child as much food. In the post-ultrasound period, there is no effect on neonatal mortality. Instead, what you observe is that the probability that that second child is a girl decreases. That is, what parents are doing is they're doing selective abortion. They're aborting girls, and that is what's skewing, on aggregate, the sex ratio towards boys. They give further evidence regarding this mechanism. They look at families whose firstborn is a boy relative to the firstborn being a girl. And those results are driven, the results that we just talked about, are driven by those families who already had a girl, whose firstborn was a girl, not by those whose firstborn was a boy. Again, this is evidence they don't mind having a girl, but they don't want 2 girls. You can also differentiate between Hindu households and those of Muslim and Christian households. Muslim and Christians have weaker traditions of dowry, and they show that the results are driven by the Hindu households. And then, when you look at the earlier period, what they find is that for those girls who made it to being ages 15 to 50, those women tend to be shorter. If the price of gold was high in that first year, these women are shorter. So despite, and the same is not true for boys, that boys are not shorter. So again, some evidence, despite being positively selected, that these women are not being nourished as well as their brothers because of the price of gold being higher. Okay. Now I'm on my last topic, which is that of cultural change. So far I've taken culture as something fixed, but I don't want to leave you with the impression that culture is static or that beliefs are uniformly held. And my recent research is really all on the question of cultural change, which is a much harder question, I would say, to study than does culture matter or not. I think that we have a lot of evidence that it does matter from many outcomes, but the question is, well, but it changes. How does it change? Why does it change? Well, if you're an economist, you try to look for exogenous things. So it changes maybe in response to shocks. What kind of shocks? Technology, the environment, policy, knowledge. Knowledge is a shock. You know things that you didn't know before. Those things change incentives. When you change incentives, you might give impetus to changes in people's beliefs because they start doing different things. It also can change simply because, as we said before, culture is social. So if, for example, a place becomes more urban, it's much easier to be anonymous in a big city like, say, Madrid, than if you're living in a little village where everyone's watching you. It's much harder to change culture when all your peers are looking at you than when you can be an anonymous individual. So the capacity to monitor or to punish transgressors can change, which then changes culture. But culture can also get stuck, especially if changing requires coordination among individuals, or especially, and this is going to be my future work, if it creates losers or winners. When a change in culture creates winners and losers, people are going to resist it more. So it's not a question, do you drive on the left or do you drive on the right? That's a social coordination question, but is it, now the competition to become a doctor? It's much more because there's a lot of women competing for those jobs. Before they were not there. Who are the losers? The losers have to be boys. I mean, they have a lower probability than before, ceteris everything else equal, of being a doctor. Okay? So I want to talk about a cultural change that most of us have lived through, which then influences family, which is cultural change towards same-sex individuals. And in particular, what I want to do is explore the giant change that we've seen in our lifetimes of attitudes, how attitudes towards same-sex relationships have changed. So what you have here is a poll from the United States that asks, is it wrong for same-sex adults to have sexual relations? And what I'm plotting there is the percentage of individuals, or the fraction of individuals, who answer it's never wrong, or only sometimes wrong. That's what I'm plotting. What else could you have answered? You could have answered, it's almost always wrong, or it's always wrong, okay? So those two, I would say, are disapproval. These two, people who answer never wrong, or only sometimes wrong, we're going to call approval. And that's what I'm graphing. And what you can see in that graph is that there's very little change in attitudes from 1973, which is the first year which we have a poll from, all the way till 1991. Not much change. And then you see a big leap upwards between 1991 and 1993, and then the continued evolution positively towards of attitudes towards same-sex relationships. So we stared at this and we asked, well, what happened between 91 and 93 to give rise to this jump? Does anybody have a hypothesis? No, la SIDA era 81, pero tienen razón, pero no. Si dan a decir solamente la SIDA, no puede ser porque eso es el 81 que empezó. Pero sí, tiene que ver con SIDA. Okay, entonces aquí, okay, so what we argue is, we remind you that AIDS started in 1981. Now, AIDS did not make people approve of same-sex relationships. If anything, it became worse. I mean, now there's this horrible thing going on. But what it did was that it organized gay individuals. Before you could be a gay person, you had money, you wanted low taxes. You're Republican. You could be a gay individual and you really care about civil liberties. You voted Democrat. Now, there's one thing on your mind. You want to find a cure for AIDS. And that is what you're really thinking about. The other things that you're thinking about are also related, like getting insurance for your domestic partner who might not be able to work because that he has AIDS, okay? So this united a diverse group of people, anyone who is gay, behind a very strong common cause. And when you have individuals who really care about one thing, if you're a politician, they become attractive to you because, one, they have money, two, they have votes. So now you're going to go for them. And that's what Bill Clinton did. So this happened in 1992 in the presidential election. This is the election between George Bush, H.W. Bush, I should say, so that we don't get confused, and Bill, not Hillary, Bill Clinton. And for the first time ever, the party platforms, which are at the national level, we're going to be seeing that now in the summer of this year. What happened here is that the party platforms took explicitly opposing stands about gay people serving openly in the military. Gays had never been mentioned before in any party platform. The only reason that had ever been mentioned once was once in the 80s in a Democratic Party platform where they talked about, you shouldn't discriminate. That was it. So, this gave rise to a very public debate. Then Clinton wins, as you know, and then this is debated in Congress for all of 1993. Until in November of 1993, this is settled with don't ask, don't tell, which is thought of as a compromise solution. Gays cannot serve openly in the military, but you're not supposed to anymore ask people, are you gay or not? That was the solution taken. What I wanted to show you is that this gave rise to an unprecedented level of attention for gay-related issues. Not just this issue of don't ask, don't tell, or gays serving in the military, but I know this is a lot to take in, so I'm just going to say it show you very briefly. If you look at these, I think it's yellow here, line, this is showing you keywords in ABC, CBS, NBC Evening News. For those of you who are below the age of 40, no internet, this is where people got their news, okay? You got the news by watching the evening news. So you can see there's a big spike. You might think it's all related to AIDS, but with the blue line, which is the ones that are the non-AIDS related gay words, is that showing you that there's a big spike in 1993, and then it goes down. What about newspapers? We can follow the same panel of newspapers and look at keywords that have to do with gay individuals. And again, you see a big spike in 1993. So this is something that the public is paying attention to because it's in the news, whether it's a newspaper or it's the evening news. Then you might think, well, maybe what's happening is really, there's a lot of things going on, and people are changing their attitudes, not just towards gay individuals, but about a whole other group of things. And so what these graphs here are, which are maybe a little bit much to take in, is to try to show you that you do not see the same discontinuities. You do not see big jumps in opinions about a whole host of things that are somewhat related. What things could they be? Extramarital sex, premarital sex, pornography laws, abortions, should a woman be in the house or outside the home? All those, they don't take a leap. It's not that they don't evolve. They do evolve. But only the red one, ours, same-sex approval, do you approve of same-sex relationship? That's the only one that jumps up. On the right-hand side, the graph on the right-hand side is showing you the same type of thing for capital punishment, having a woman president, more restrictive gun laws, interracial marriages, having a black president, and capital punishment. Again, it's not that these things don't change. It's the fact is that none of these see a jump between 1991 and 1993, the way that same-sex approval does. So our hypothesis was that the public debate and the greater salience of gay-related issues led people to reconsider their positions And this is what initiated a process of cultural change and the diffusion of different values over time. Now, this is a moment in time, and when you do economics, when you look at change in time, you can't convince anybody of anything because everything's changing, you don't know what's going on. So we need heterogeneity, and the way that we get heterogeneity is we look at individuals from places with more exposure to gay individuals, as opposed to individuals who come with places with less exposure to individuals. And our argument is that if you have more exposure to gay individuals, and I don't necessarily mean face-to-face contact, although that could be possible, if you have more exposure to gay individuals, you're likely to have more gay demonstrations, you're likely to have more news that covers gay events, you're likely to have more gay friends and acquaintances. All these things are a bundle that would be related to how many gay people there are around where you live. Now, the problem is, how do you measure how many gay people there are? You know, we don't have polls at that moment that say, are you gay? But what we can do are two things. One is we can look at the cumulative HIV rate, so the cumulative AIDS rate, I call it, in 1992 at the state level. How much AIDS there was. That is one way to measure it. It's not perfect, but it's one way. The other thing is that the 1990 census was the first census that asked, are you living with another adult in the household? And then, you know, is that adult a man or a woman? And then you know that person's sex, you know the sex of the other person. You can presume, again, that these are same-sex partners. So what I'm showing you here is how these same attitudes, the approval of same-sex relationships, evolved over time using both of these measures. One of them is the cumulative AIDS rate. The other one is the gay population. That is, how many, you know, what fraction of the population lives in households with same-sex individuals. Let's just divide them into high, medium, low. There's states where it's high, medium, and low. And what I'm showing you is how the attitudes evolve differently in high, which is the pink, versus low, for both measures that we've just talked about for exposure. And as you can see, from the beginning, those places with high exposure, let me just say high exposure from now on, high exposure have significantly more approval than places with low exposure. That's not the point. The question is, in 1992, when you have these debates in 92 and 93, do we see a jump that's larger for high exposure places than it is for low exposure places? And this is raw data, so you can't really tell that much for it, but I'm going to argue that, yes, indeed, we do. So we do with something that is, in economics is called a difference in difference strategy. That is, we ask, did attitudes evolve more positively in the 90s, in high exposure relative to low exposure, than they had already in the 70s? So in the 70s is already a gap. Everybody becomes more positive, but does the gap increase? The answer is yes. And the answer is yes, controlling for a large variety of things that could be different across these states at different points in time, including age, sex, race, education, household income. Do you live in a small city? Do you live in a country? Do you live in a town? Do you live in a suburb? And all of those things are interacted with a decade. Why interacted with a decade? Well, because the importance of these things might matter differently in the 70s relative to the 80s, relative to the 90s. So there's poll year and state or county fixed effects as well. And let me just, I'm not going to drag you through the regressions. Let me just tell you what our answer is. We find that individuals who live in high exposure states, as measured by the cumulative AIDS rates, increase approval by additional 5.5 percentage points in the 90s relative to the low AIDS states and relative to the gap that existed. So the gap was there, and now it increased by 5.5 percentage points. A similar exercise for the gay population measure of exposure finds that that gap increases by 7.7 percentage points. So we think of this as an example of how incentives for people to organize and come out ultimately led to cultural change. We do a whole host of robustness exercises. You ask, well, what about if we control for people's religious beliefs? How does that matter? We use a different definition of approving of same-sex relationships. We include a linear state trend. We exclude 2002 because there's an additional jump. We exclude highest and lowest AIDS rates place. We use a different definition of the cumulative AIDS rate. We look at it in 1989. We look at strict terciles, we look at median, and then we control for something that's endogenous, which is what your political party affiliation is, not formal affiliation, but which one do you identify with. And as you can see, or not, you always have about a 5.5 or 7.5 percentage points increase if you come from a high exposure state or county. We try to understand the mechanisms by looking at people's interest in politics during a much shorter time period between 84 and 91, and then the post period, 92 to 98. We find it very hard to find a convincing relationship between these two things. But what we do find, which I think is very fascinating, is we divide our sample into men versus women. And then we find that all of the action comes from women. It's women who changed their attitudes in the 90s in high exposure states, not men. So that the fact that this is 0 over here, basically, or it doesn't have stars, it's telling you, well, when you make men and women into two different categories, you see that men were hiding the fact that women became much more positive, not 5.5 percentage points, but 10.7 percentage points. So a lot is going on with women. And you can do this for the different measures, and you end up with the same results. It's always women who are becoming much more positive. So now let me ask, and with our mystery, why? Why women? Why not men? One possibility is that women tend to have more gay friends and acquaintances. Certainly, they're much more likely to know their friends or acquaintances are gay. And that's true in the data. But this has not become more important. Now, it's not great data, I should say, but it doesn't seem to become more important in the 90s. Do they care more about kids? We have some evidence that women care more about kids. What we find is that, if you have kids under the age of 18, this impacts negatively on your approval. But that's true for women and men. It's not differentially true. And we do not see any change in the 90s. Is it machismo? Or maybe men are more threatened by, these feminine, what they think of as more feminine men, because it challenges their identity as men. It's hard to measure that. We look at men whose mothers worked while they were growing up. Often you find that men whose mothers work are more liberal. They're less machista. And of course, we do find it. We find that men whose mothers worked are more likely to approve. But then you ask, well, did these men become differentially less likely or more likely? Is that the problem? No, it doesn't seem to go through there. There's no effect, and for women, it has no effect. Whether she had a working mother or not have a working mother, that did not differentially change her attitudes towards same-sex individuals. So let me conclude. I hope I've convinced you that social beliefs and family cultural traditions can matter to economic outcomes. I've only given you a smattering of examples. If you're interested, you are very welcome to read our handbook chapter, which has many more. It matters to things that is like women's labor force participation, gender segregation and occupational choice, who spends time with children, etc. This, for a long time, was really overlooked in economics. Now, this is far less so, and people are much more convinced that you need to look about the family and the family's beliefs to think about economic outcomes. But then I don't want to leave you with the idea that culture is destiny. Culture changes. It's not something you're stuck with. They can change, and they can often change radically, as we saw for same-sex individuals, in response to other things that are going on in the environment. So I would say that policy needs to take culture into account, but it should not become a slave to it. That is, it should not take it as something that's fixed. Okay, thank you very much.
¿Funciona?
Bueno, en español, si alguien quiere hacer preguntas o bien en español o en inglés, para Raquel hay unos micros. Adelante.
Any questions?
Buenas tardes.
Hello, thank you very much for this excellent presentation. I'm not an expert in economics, I'm an engineer, but I didn't think that the economy could be related to gender or to kinship. I think that this was a wonderful analysis, the one you carried out, and other authors carried out. I would like to know if in any ethnic group which are very endogamous, even in Spain, in the Basque Country, it is very common for people to marry within the same family. I would like to know whether any study was conducted about tribal things, right? Or this is similar to what happens in Africa with different tribes. There is a lady, a scholar in Barcelona, who looked into that matter. But if she did, I don't remember whether she looked at the Spanish context. So I'd rather say that I will look it up, and if you send me an email, I will answer. Any further questions?
Bueno, lo primero.
First of all, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. It's been very interesting. I do know something about economics because I'm about to become an economist. And I think that the last study was particularly interesting. And I would like to ask you whether there could be any reverse causality and whether you have controlled for it, because you say that a higher exposure to homosexuals could be leading to a greater acceptance of homosexuals, but perhaps a higher exposure to homosexuals may be leading people to openly declare that they're openly gay, and therefore they can perhaps contract AIDS. That's why we use two measures, because AIDS is not really related to acceptance. The symptoms take about 10 years to become overt. So the AIDS cases you see started developing 10 years before. So I don't think that you should be afraid of reverse causality. Further questions? Hello. When you think about these things related to culture, how many of those are preferences, and have you thought about this? How many are they varying preferences, and how many are they beliefs on returns or attitudes, which may be different? I think that as human beings, we don't have many innate preferences. We may prefer savory or sweet things.
Compartimos.
But having a preference towards a certain kind of belief or about how a family should be organized or whether there should be such a thing as a right price I don't think that you can think in those terms. I don't think that those things should be called a preference. This is an empirical reason. Now, a more theoretical reason, not theoretical from the point of view of a large theory, but from the point of view of the economy, is that if you're going to do economics, sometimes you want to develop theorems on well-being. And if you think that preferences are endogenous, then those theorems cannot be used, because how can you say this person is happier? Well, you give them 100 euros and you're going to be happier. But if I change some institution and I change, how can I assess that person's well-being? I can't. So now I'm about to publish a paper that does discuss preferences, but I prefer to see them as beliefs. If you look at how much the role of women has changed in the last 150 years, it's difficult to think that what is changing is preferences. Genetics changes very slowly, as we know. So it's not really your preferences, it's your beliefs. And obviously, your beliefs, to a certain extent, are also shape your preferences. If you have never eaten sushi and you're given raw fish, you will say, "Wow, this is disgusting," because you're not used to eating uncooked fish. Is this your preference or your beliefs? It's difficult. It is beliefs because you were brought up in a culture where people didn't eat raw food. 30 years ago, there were not that many sushi restaurants. So that division is really artificial between preferences and beliefs. But I prefer to call them beliefs that then may give rise to preferences. Well, thank you very much. I'm also an engineer, and I really enjoyed to hear about the huge impact that these elements have on the economy. And I particularly one of them comes to my mind, which is age discrimination or ageism. This is not a word I like very much. Oh yes, ageism, right. But it's a phenomenon that has started to become a reality. Are there any studies on ageism and on the impact of ageism on the economy? Yeah, you mean about the role played by older people? No, I haven't heard of anything, but I think it would be an interesting topic to analyze, because different cultures treat older people very differently, right? Some people see them as a source of wisdom, others see them as useless parts of society. And then, of course, who should look after the elderly? The state, their children, men, women. I think it's a very interesting topic. Thank you very much. I will ask my question in English.
You were talking about the winners and the losers of changes in cultural policies. So how should we, so of course we can think about the welfare changes when we are designing a policy, but then it's also true that when we implement these policies, we can create polarization between men and women. So when we are thinking about cultural changes in laws and how these policies are designed, do you think that exposure in longer term would make losers more prone to these cultural views, or should we worry about the polarization between the two groups?
I mean, I don't know how much you want to worry about polarization. I mean, to the extent that it creates a backlash, people get worried about these things. Okay, so if you're promoting women's rights, or in the United States, minority rights, you might worry there's a backlash afterwards. I don't think that means you don't want to do it. And also, it's very hard to tell what's going to be accepted and what's not. Look at smoking. everybody used to smoke in restaurants, in bars, everywhere. That changed really quickly once there became a law that said you are not allowed to smoke. And look at how much smoking has decreased, maybe less in Spain. But it really had a giant impact. So you create winners and losers, but sometimes people accept it, sometimes there's a backlash. That doesn't mean you don't want to do the right thing. Yeah.
Muchas gracias por la presentación.
Thank you for your presentation. When you think about quality, when you think about cultural change quality, I can think about three types of factors that trigger culture change. One of them is exposure to other cultures, in line with what you were saying. Another one is that many cultural practices served a purpose. And if that purpose changes, then, for example, genital mutilation. And then there's a third one, which is a change in power relations in terms of cultural changes that have the winners and the losers. However, the truth is that when you look at the literature, you find many things. There's many papers in favor of the contact hypothesis, but of course it may generate a backlash. It depends on the time and the place at which the contact takes place. Same goes for cultural practices that served a purpose. And my question to you as an expert is, how do you reconcile that puzzle in the literature? Why there's so much heterogeneity, you mean? Well, in general, I agree that it is related with winners and losers. For example, with respect to same-sex individuals, that all of them are winners. And things are changing, even the church, because it doesn't make any sense. In the same way as you cannot predict that whether your children are going to be gay or straight, let's make society more tolerant. That can only, be advantageous. That is an easy thing. But the others are, yes, they are closely related to power, and they're more difficult, but the literature doesn't, well, first, the literature hasn't considered theoretically when things are going to change and when things are not going to change. It just showed whether culture matters or not. And now there's started to be some studies analyzing, changes in culture. But it's difficult to anticipate when there's going to be a change. And then also, we should also think about things that have not changed. But this is all in its infancy. If you invite me back here in 10 years' time, I may be able to give you a more comprehensive response. This is going to be the last question. When you talked about smoking, I just thought that, for example, institutions are imposing more and more restrictions on smoking, but there's other alternatives such as electronic cigarettes. So one addiction is being replaced by another. So is there any theorem that you can use to say, well, I'm going to design a policy for which a person should not replace one addiction for another? Well, taxes, really. vaping didn't exist before, it's not that it was created overnight. It took its time. And now, of course, you can prohibit it, or you can levy high taxes on it. If you believe it's so bad, you can just levy high taxes on it, as, governments do on alcohol and many other things. Okay. This brings us to the end of this session. Thank you very much, Raquel, for your wonderful talk, and thank you all very much for joining us this evening. Thank you.